That's nice and quiet. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 2016 SPERI annual lecture. It's quite amazing to see so many of you out there, and on behalf of SPERI and the university, I want sincerely to thank all of you, both old and new attendees at SPERI events, for the support you so repeatedly show for the kind of work that we do at SPERI. My name is Tony Payne. I'm one of the directors of SPERI, and I'm not really going to say anything at all about SPERI itself in this introduction. We've been around a while now. I hope you're familiar with the intellectual agenda we've set ourselves. And we put a small brochure about SPERI on every seat to give you something to flick through while you were waiting. The one practical announcement I've been asked to make is that you refrain from using any flash photography if you want to take photographs during the event. And having said that, let me move on straight away to my key task and very great privilege, which is to introduce to you as the SPERI annual lecturer for this year, Nicola Sturgeon, member of the Scottish Parliament and First Minister of Scotland. Now, she's difficult to introduce because she is, of course, someone we already think we know well because of her public role, and in particular, I think, because of the considerable splash that she has made in what I think we can still just about call British politics since the moment she was elected leader of the Scottish Nationalist Party in November 2014. And many profiles have familiarised us with the key elements of Nicola Sturgeon's early story. Born in Irvine in North Ayrshire, studying law at the University of Glasgow, then working as a solicitor in Glasgow, wanting to see change in Scotland, but drawn not to the Labour Party, but to the SNP. Entering the Scottish Parliament in her late 20s and rising fast to ministerial office in a devolved SNP government, then becoming Deputy First Minister, and then following the outcome of the Scottish referendum, being elected leader of her party and thus becoming First Minister, a position to which she was re-elected in May of this year when the SNP again emerged as much the largest party in the Scottish Parliament. So it's been a stellar rise, and yet there is, I think, even more to it than that. We've worked very hard in SPERI to persuade Nicola Sturgeon to come to Sheffield to give the annual lecture this year. We've been talking to her office, in fact, for well over a year. And our keenness to get the First Minister to come to Sheffield really derives from a judgment that Nicola Sturgeon is the most interesting political leader in Britain today. And I say that, sounds a big thing to say, but I say that because she sits at the centre, absolutely at the centre, of what I think are the three most pressing debates that bear upon Britain at this most difficult moment in our history. Let me very briefly explain what I mean. Cast your minds back to that general election campaign of May 2015. It's not all that long ago, although so much has happened it feels almost like prehistory. Remember those leaders' debates which Nicola Sturgeon won by displaying just the right mixture of charm, firmness, and compassion. And remember in particular the way that she set out for Scotland in that campaign what amounted to, I think, a social democratic critique of both the hard and the soft neoliberalism that was being offered across Britain as a whole by both the Conservative and Labour parties respectively. And to those of us living outside of Scotland and also outside the heartlands of Conservative England, it was a tantalising hint of what perhaps could have been. So that challenge to the inherited political economy consensus of the preceding 30 years or so could not but draw considerable attention to Nicola Sturgeon, and it forced all of us, I think, to recognise just how serious she was at presenting herself and her future government in Scotland as anti-austerity and, if I can put it this way, pro-society. So that's one debate, an ongoing debate that she's still absolutely at the centre of. But second, and very obviously, the outcome of the Scottish referendum in September 2014 has left on the table the possibility of a second referendum if certain key circumstances change, etc., etc. And that continuing prospect has had an impact outside of Scotland as well, in the other devolved nations, obviously, but also across the north of England in particular. I think there was briefly a website set up in Yorkshire that had a petition where you could sign up if you wanted Scotland to take us with her, as and when it became independent. But the serious point is that Scotland's economic development and its economic prospects do bear very much upon the equivalent prospects of the north of England, and they do so in a way that will remain uncertain until the future of the British Union is decided, at least for the medium term. We've had a very successful workshop in SPERI this afternoon entitled Scotland, the North and Economic Development, compatriots or competitors, ? So we also have a number of other guests here from Scotland this afternoon, apart from the First Minister and her team, and we're very pleased to have you in Sheffield too. And then finally, the third debate to which I alluded, as if this mix of issues was not rich enough. You may have noticed it, but something's occurred called Brexit, or something is occurring called Brexit. And I'm not going to say anything at all about Brexit because nobody really knows yet what it might mean. But what is clear is that Nicola Sturgeon has already asserted her right to take part in this debate on behalf of the people she leads, and no one can doubt that she will be a key player in the new inter-nation politics of how Brexit eventually plays out across Britain. Now, I don't know about you, but I find all of this daunting enough just to describe. Can neoliberalism be successfully challenged or at least reformed? Can that challenge be driven from Scotland alone, or would it require a broader British political base or series of alliances to achieve? Will the United Kingdom continue to remain a United Kingdom? Should it remain a United Kingdom? Can Scotland operate successfully in economic terms as an independent state? What are the consequences for the north of England of Scotland's economic policies, whether pursued as an independent country or via some version of Devo Max? And more alarmingly, perhaps, how will the rest of the UK, as the civil service have already dubbed this smaller state that is the UK without some of its constituent nations and potential nation states, how will any of these groupings cope effectively outside of the European Union? Well, my job, thankfully, is only to ask these questions and to lead research into them. It's the job of Nicola Sturgeon to address them practically and to manage her and our way through them. So it's with huge pleasure that I invite the First Minister of Scotland to speak to the title of her lecture, which is Scotland and the UK, Economic Policy After the EU Referendum. First Minister.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Tony, for that kind introduction. I was starting to feel exhausted just listening to you outline my various responsibilities, so thank you for that reminder. Thank you also to all of you for coming along here this evening. It's fantastic to look out and see so many people here. It is a real pleasure, indeed, a real honour for me to be here with you this evening. There are many links, actually, between Scotland and Sheffield. Indeed, you might be interested to know that Mary, Queen of Scots, actually spent more of her life in Sheffield than she did in Scotland. She stayed here for 14 years. Admittedly, she didn't have much choice in the matter. She spent the entire 14 years in prison. So I'm delighted and quite relieved, I have to say, to find that your hospitality has improved immeasurably since the days of Mary, Queen of Scots, and to receive such a warm welcome here this evening. And I can assure you that my main regret about this visit is that I'm not able to stay here longer. There are, of course, many other significant and happier connections between Scotland and the city, and indeed between Scotland and this university. Both Scotland and Sheffield celebrated last month when Sir Fraser Stoddart, a graduate of Edinburgh University and a former lecturer here at Sheffield, was awarded the Nobel Prize for Chemistry. And from my time as Health Secretary in Scotland, I'm very aware of and very grateful for the quality of the work done by the School of Public Health here. Its alcohol research group carried out an extensive study on alcohol minimum pricing, which underpins the legislation that the Scottish Parliament passed on that issue back in 2012. Now, that legislation has faced significant court challenges, but following a positive court judgment last month, we may now be getting to a position where we can implement it, and if that is the case, then work done here in Sheffield will contribute to saving dozens of lives in Scotland every year. And the Public Health School, I think, is a good example of the excellence of this university's work. And so, of course, is this research institute. Sheffield University's Political Economy Research Centre was, of course, launched in 1994, and SPERI itself was established in 2012. In recent years, it has developed a really strong reputation for its academic work and its efforts to improve the public understanding of political economy. And this annual lecture is one part of that important mission, and I'm really honoured to have been asked to deliver it this evening. Now, as Tony said, I want to talk tonight about economic policy after Brexit. And Tony, I don't think it's right to say that we don't know what Brexit means. Brexit means Brexit. I thought everybody knew what Brexit meant. But I'm going to argue this evening that the result of the EU referendum presents all of us, and it certainly presents the UK government and the Scottish government with two major challenges. Following the vote, there is a clear need to find, if not the best outcome, because my view is the best outcome would be to remain in the European Union, but certainly the least worst outcome as we negotiate new agreements with the EU and indeed the wider world. And the EU referendum also poses a broader challenge for those of us who support free trade, who welcome immigration, and who believe that the benefits of globalisation, if properly managed, should outweigh the benefits. It's how we manage those policies and make sure that those policies benefit everyone in our society. How do we guarantee that an open economy commands widespread support instead of, sometimes for understandable reasons, breeding popular resentment? And in dealing with that issue, I'm going to begin, as you might expect, by looking at the outcome of the EU referendum. After all, our response to that outcome will define Scotland and the rest of the UK for decades to come. It won't simply determine our economic prosperity, it will also shape the sort of society we are. Scotland, as most of you know, voted very clearly to stay in the EU by a fairly emphatic margin of 62% to 38%. And as a result of that outcome, there has, as Tony alluded to, been a lot of speculation about whether Brexit will indeed lead to a second referendum on Scottish independence. And there are good reasons for asking that question. After all, before the independence referendum in 2014, one of the key arguments, one of the central arguments made by those who opposed independence was that Scotland could only safeguard our place in the EU if we voted to stay in the UK. That argument has turned out to be rather false, as we've seen of late. In many respects, in fact, and as a direct result of the Brexit vote, the UK that Scotland voted to be part of in 2014 is likely to change fundamentally, is already changing fundamentally. So it is entirely reasonable for Scotland to have the option of reconsidering the decision that we took in 2014. However, moving towards a second referendum on independence has not been my starting point in addressing the result of the EU referendum. I've been very clear about that since the morning after the Brexit vote back in June. My clear starting point has been and continues to be today to find the best way to protect Scotland's interests, the best way to retain as far as we possibly can the benefits of EU membership. I want to secure as far as possible the outcome that Scotland voted for in June. And to try to achieve that, I and the Scottish Government are pursuing two parallel approaches. The first one is one that directly affects all of you. The Scottish Government is determined to do everything we can to influence the UK Government's approach to Brexit. Now, it's fair to say that so far we've found our discussions with the UK Government on this issue, and I'm trying to be diplomatic here, less enlightening than we would have liked them to be. Indeed, I was quite taken aback 2 weeks ago after a meeting in Downing Street to be accused of trying to undermine the UK's negotiating position on Brexit. Taken aback because it is quite literally impossible for me to undermine the UK's negotiating position on Brexit, because I have absolutely no idea what it is. In fact, I'm not even sure that it exists. In fact, I think the UK Government's line that it won't set out its negotiating stance because it doesn't want to show the rest of Europe its hand is rather like that old "the dog ate my homework" line. It's an excuse to hide the fact that there is nothing there to show. But nevertheless, in spite of that frustration, it is the intention of the government that I lead to seek to continue to work with and to engage with the UK Government in good faith. And in doing so, we intend to set out the Scottish Government's clear view that the UK as a whole should seek to retain full membership of the single market, meaning, amongst other things, that we continue to trade with our EU partners without tariff and non-tariff barriers. And I think there's a strong democratic justification for that approach. After all, 48% of the electorate UK-wide voted to remain in the EU. So did 2 of the 4 nations of the UK. And of course, Sheffield is a perfect example of how close the referendum result was in much of England. The city voted to leave by 51% to 49%, only 6,000 votes separating the two sides. Now, I, for the avoidance of any doubt, completely accept that there was a majority, albeit a narrow majority, in England and in Wales for leaving the European Union. But I don't believe that it can be concluded that there was a majority anywhere in the UK for leaving the single market. In fact, voters were often told that leaving the EU did not necessarily mean leaving the single market. So I don't believe there is a meaningful democratic mandate for what has become known as a hard Brexit. I don't believe there is a parliamentary majority for hard Brexit either. In these circumstances, surely single market membership is the obvious consensus position. And that's a point, of course, that there is now an opportunity to make forcibly in Parliament following last week's court decision. And the MPs of the party I lead will therefore seek to build a coalition, an alliance in the House of Commons to avert a hard Brexit. And the simple fact is, in my view, that continuing single market membership will be the least damaging outcome for individuals, for businesses and for communities across the whole of the UK. You know, it's worth looking at the university sector as an example of that. Scotland has 5 universities that, like Sheffield University, are ranked in the world's top 200. In fact, Scotland has more world-class universities per head of population than any other country in the world, apart from Luxembourg. So for Scotland, as for Sheffield, our universities are an incredible cultural, social and economic asset. And yet just last week, the principal of one of our leading universities, Edinburgh, not somebody who is known for exaggeration, told a House of Commons Select Committee that the impact of Brexit on higher education, and I quote, ranges from bad to awful to catastrophic. And it's easy to see why. In Scotland, 1/6 of our academic staff are EU citizens from outside the UK. so are 1/6 of our postgraduate students. Those EU students are disproportionately likely to be in subjects such as science and technology, which will be critical to our economic success in the future. And if you look at research, Scotland benefits hugely from the opportunities for collaboration that are provided by European programmes. But of course, the only countries other than EU member states that have full access to the European research area are members of EFTA and countries that are candidates for membership of the EU. Even being in EFTA isn't ideal if, like Switzerland, you're outside the single market. In fact, Switzerland recently had its status as a research partner downgraded after it voted to abandon agreements with the EU on free movement. And so single market membership provides the best basis for minimising the damage that Brexit will do to higher education. It will enable universities to continue to collaborate within the European research area. It will give security to students and staff who do us the honour of coming here to study, to live and to work. And it might just help to mitigate the reputational damage that I believe Brexit has already caused to the UK in a sector that competes for the very best people across the globe. And of course, the consequences of Brexit go far beyond our universities. I've just come here from this university's Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre. It is an absolutely magnificent facility that we're keen to seek to emulate in Scotland. And it demonstrates just how much potential there still is in high-value manufacturing on these islands. But it's likely that our manufacturing and export industries generally will suffer if they're outside the single market. The Institute of Fiscal Studies has tried to quantify the consequences of this already. It estimates that losing membership of the single market will cost the UK approximately 4% of GDP. That's almost 2 years of average economic growth. Strathclyde University's Fraser of Allender Institute has estimated that a hard Brexit will cost 80,000 jobs in Scotland alone, and perhaps see real wages fall by an average of £2,000 a year. So when the UK government negotiates to leave the EU, single market membership should, in my view, be sought as a priority. Now, some parts of that, such as retaining freedom of movement, I know will not satisfy everyone, but there is no ideal solution which does satisfy everyone. Although a hard Brexit might appease some members of the UK Cabinet, it will damage trade, reduce employment, and cause unnecessary hardship in communities across the country. I believe it's economically undesirable and democratically unjustifiable. And for that reason, and this is the second strand of our approach, the Scottish Government is also exploring whether distinctive solutions are possible for Scotland. In particular, if the UK Government does decide to take the rest of the UK out of the single market, then the Scottish Government will seek a separate settlement that allows us to stay in. We will publish options for doing that over the next few weeks. And it's worth saying at this stage that allowing for distinctive solutions in different parts of the UK will not be straightforward. I don't believe for a second that it will be. But nothing about Brexit is straightforward. We're already hearing discussions about options for a flexible Brexit with the possibility of different deals for sectors such as car manufacturing and financial services, and for areas such as Gibraltar. There's clearly a very strong need to look at special arrangements in Northern Ireland to protect the peace process and avoid a hard border between the north and the south. All of that underlines the fact that we are now in unprecedented circumstances. And so all of us in Scotland, across the UK, and indeed throughout the EU, should approach discussions with creativity, flexibility, and a genuine desire to secure the best outcomes. And if we do that, then distinctive solutions may well be possible for Scotland. And alongside our work to find these solutions, the Scottish Government will continue to focus on the second key challenge that the EU referendum has undoubtedly highlighted. And this is an issue which is becoming apparent in many parts of the developed world. We know that policies like free trade and immigration often bring benefits to the economy as a whole, but they also have the potential to disadvantage particular areas and particular groups in our society. So the sustainability of these policies is increasingly dependent on our ability to ensure that they benefit not the few, but the many. As Christine Lagarde of the IMF said in a speech just a couple of months ago, if we want to keep globalisation alive for the next generation, there is no alternative to ensuring that it works to the benefit of all. In my view, this focus on inclusive growth, as it is often known, is first and foremost a matter of basic morality. Everyone in our society, in any society, should have a fair chance to fulfil their potential. But it's also an issue of basic economic efficiency. There's strong and growing evidence that inequality in Western economies has harmed economic growth. And the UK is a very good example of that. The OECD has estimated that between 1990 and 2010, rising inequality reduced growth by 9 percentage points. And inclusive growth is also increasingly a political imperative. The vote to leave the EU a few months ago had many causes, and we'll be investigating and researching and exploring those causes, I'm sure, for a long time to come. But we know already that people on low incomes were more likely to vote to leave. And when you allow for student numbers, so too were areas with low employment rates. And that was highlighted in a recent report from the Inclusive Growth Commission of the Royal Society of the Arts. It pointed out that the referendum has revealed the extent of voter dissatisfaction with our current economic model. And it quoted a councillor who'd spoken about the referendum at one of its evidence sessions here in Sheffield. And he said, "We could have told you that our communities would have voted to leave before Christmas. Project fear over the economy crashing if we voted to leave fell empty on the ears of many people, because for them, the economy crashed 10 years ago." Now that quote, I think, perfectly summarises a basic truth. There is no point in telling people to fear change if they believe that the worst has already happened to them, if their current circumstances simply do not inspire hope for the future. And although the quote that I've just used comes from Sheffield, it surely speaks of the experience of many people right across these islands. Certainly, as I've already indicated, I'm proud that Scotland voted so strongly to remain in the EU. But I'm also acutely aware that even in Scotland, 1 million people voted to leave. Now, this sort of issue, these debates are not unique to these islands. If we look across the Atlantic, we see a presidential election campaign where one candidate, if I may say, hopefully the losing candidate tomorrow, is promising to re-establish tariff barriers and quite literally to build walls. But it is clearly an important problem here in the UK. And perhaps the most worrying recent manifestation of this is some of the language that we are now hearing about immigration. You know, people who choose to come and live and work in Scotland and the UK make a huge contribution to our economy, to our public services, and to our wider society. They are our neighbours, our colleagues, our friends. And of course, many British citizens choose to live, work and study in other EU countries. Immigration is a two-way street. And so I never expected that I would ever hear a governing party say, as happened in Birmingham last month, that companies might have to publish lists of overseas workers, or that doctors from overseas might be allowed to stay in the UK until we trained our own, as though we're somehow they're doing us a favour by coming here, working hard and saving lives in our National Health Service. Now, I'm well aware, very acutely aware, that the scale of immigration in England, certainly in parts of England, makes it understandably a bigger topic of debate than it is in Scotland. And I also know that people have very often very legitimate concerns about whether increased immigration affects their own access to public services and to housing. But in my view, in my very strong view, the answer to that isn't to target and demonise immigration as the source of these problems. It's to invest in our public services in order to address the underlying causes of these legitimate concerns. It's to generate hope rather than to play on fears. And a key part of my argument tonight is that UK economic policy, arguably over several decades, but certainly in recent years has not given enough people enough grounds for hope. You know, it's worth looking back at the final part of last year's SPERI lecture by Lord Skidelsky. It was called The Failure of Austerity, and he highlighted evidence that UK government policy since 2010 had reduced the UK's GDP by 5%, and he concluded rather gloomily that the damage is set to continue. The party I lead argued strongly against austerity economics before the 2015 general election, and that's something that Lord Skidelsky was kind enough to acknowledge in his lecture. So it's not surprising that I agree strongly with his view on the cost of UK government policy, but it's a failure that has become more obvious than ever over the course of the last year. The current government, of course, has already abandoned its deficit reduction targets, those that it was elected on in 2015, just as the previous government abandoned in 2012 the deficit reduction target it set itself in 2010. And there's a good reason for that. The severity of government cuts permanently reduced the productive capacity of the economy. As a result, these austerity cuts hindered rather than helped attempts to reduce government deficit and debt. Austerity, in my view, is a policy that has failed categorically and comprehensively on its own terms. But it's also imposed needless hardship on individuals and families the length and breadth of the country. Lord Skidelsky spoke last year of the pain being withstood by the victims of austerity. We know that pain was is still disproportionately inflicted on women, those on low incomes, and people with disabilities. Austerity hasn't just harmed our economy, it is damaging the very fabric of our society. And as things stand, as Lord Skidelsky predicted, that damage is set to continue. For example, as more people move on to universal credit, more are affected by the changes that came into force in April. They mean that most working families with children will start to see their benefits reduced when they earn £192 a week, when that level was previously over £200 a week or £260 for lone parents. These changes to the work allowance will reduce the income of affected households by an average of £1,000 a year by 2020. And a Resolution Foundation report highlights that in total, working families with low or medium incomes are likely to be £2,000 worse off in 2020 than would otherwise have been the case, as a direct result of both austerity and Brexit. Now, the Chancellor, of course, has already made one welcome change by abandoning the government's balanced budget target. But in 2 weeks' time, in the autumn budget statement, I hope he goes further in slowing the pace of deficit reduction even more, allowing for the reversal of cuts that are hurting low-income households and damaging public services. Because if he fails to do that, if he continues on the path of austerity, then what will happen is that the resentment, the understandable resentment that I believe is a key factor in the Brexit vote that we saw, will simply become more embedded and more pronounced. Austerity, I think, has one other effect that I want to mention this evening. The narrative surrounding austerity has, I think, stifled rather than supported debate about the other key and fundamental issues facing our economy. Those issues are how we raise productivity, how we ensure that everybody can earn a decent living as more jobs become automated, how we adapt to the requirements of an ageing population, how we manage the move to a low or no carbon economy. And of course, there's the question that perhaps encompasses all of these. How do we ensure that sustainable economic growth enables people to live happier, healthier, more fulfilling lives? How do we create a good society alongside a successful economy? These are fundamental issues that all governments and societies should be asking themselves. Now, the Scottish Government doesn't have all of the answers. Nobody does. But we are, at the very least, beginning to ask some of the right questions. Last year, when the Scottish Government revised our economic strategy, we deliberately ensured that it focused jointly on increasing competitiveness and tackling inequality. Professor Joe Stiglitz, one of the Nobel laureates who serves on my Council of Economic Advisors, said at the time that tackling inequality is the foremost challenge that governments face. He went on to say that Scotland's economic strategy leads the way in identifying the challenges and provides a strong vision for change. And we decided, as a matter of deliberate policy, to prioritise competitiveness and fairness jointly, because both are equally important. We need a competitive economy to fund the public services that all of us value so highly. But it is just as true that a more equal society where everyone can participate to their full potential will lead to a stronger and more sustainable economy in turn. Workers who are well educated and trained, well paid and highly valued and supported will be more productive than those who aren't. So our economic strategy acknowledges the importance of tackling poverty, of investing in and working with local communities, and of supporting public services. It ensures, for example, that one of the key priorities of my government, a near doubling of childcare for all 3- and 4-year-olds, is recognised for its economic impact as well as for its social benefits. But also attempts to develop a partnership for productivity with business, where government invests in skills and innovation and infrastructure to build a competitive economy, and where we help and encourage businesses to invest in the capabilities of their workforces. So businesses have been heavily involved in our improvements to vocational training for young people. They're also helping us to promote entrepreneurship in schools and to encourage more start-up companies. And the Scottish Government, as you would expect, has acted as a champion for business. In 2011, we retained our enterprise body at a time when regional development agencies in England were being abolished. We've promoted economic sectors where Scotland has a comparative advantage: food and drink, energy, financial services and creative industries. And we're currently taking additional steps in the wake of the EU referendum to boost exports by marketing Scottish businesses across the world. We're also supporting the transition to a low-carbon economy. We've established some of the most ambitious climate change targets anywhere in the world, and we've met them 5 years ahead of schedule. But that's because we see tackling climate change not just as a moral imperative, although it most certainly is, but as a source of economic opportunity as well. And as part of our support for business, we work with companies to create an economy where sustainable growth benefits employers, employees and wider communities. And one area where our approach, I think, is quite distinct from the UK's is our focus on fair work. We established a Fair Work Convention last year. It's a partnership between government, employers, employees and trade unions. We work closely and well with trade unions. We see them as part of the solution to many of the problems we face, not part of the problem. The convention aims to promote productivity in a way that ensures that companies and employees all benefit. Last year we issued public sector procurement guidance which explicitly recognises fair work, including payment of the living wage, as an important consideration when we decide how public sector contracts are awarded. We're starting to use the influence and the purchasing power of government to send a clear signal. Progressive employment practices should be celebrated, not simply because they are good in themselves, although they are good in themselves, but because they also contribute to long-term business success. There is, of course, still much more to do, but we are seeing some promising results. When I became First Minister 2 years ago, there were fewer than 50 living wage accredited employers in Scotland. Now there are more than 600. A higher proportion of workers are paid the living wage in Scotland than in any other country in the UK. And importantly, these social gains have not come at the expense of competitiveness. We consistently outperform every part of the UK except London when it comes to attracting inward investment. The number of registered businesses in Scotland is at a record level, and unemployment in Scotland is again lower than it is elsewhere in the UK, despite the fact that our growth has been hit by difficulties in the oil and gas sector in the last 2 years. Our productivity has grown since 2007, while the UK's has stagnated. So we still have a huge amount more to do to build the economy and the society we want to see, but we are making progress towards achieving stronger, more sustainable and more inclusive growth. And that, in my view, is essential to tackling many of the issues that underpinned the referendum result in June. Now, at the beginning of my remarks, I mentioned the fact that this institute's predecessor, the Sheffield Political Economy Research Centre, was established in 1994. Professor J.K. Galbraith spoke at the launch, so I thought I'd end today by quoting some of the remarks he made on that day. He pointed out that economics is central to personal well-being and social tranquility, and to the educational and cultural advance, which both ensures further economic advance and enlarges life in general. I think those words are a reminder that fundamentally, the major choices we make in economic policy aren't just about what sort of economy we want to create. They are about the sort of society we want to live in. In everything I say and do, therefore, in responding to the results of the EU referendum, I'm determined that Scotland will continue to be not just a successful, dynamic and open economy, but also a fair, inclusive and welcoming society. In the months and years that lie ahead, the Scottish Government will, as I've set out, argue passionately for staying inside the single market. We value the ability to cooperate and trade freely with our European neighbours. We will also argue for inclusive growth through Westminster policies, and we will attempt to exemplify that through our actions in Scotland. We'll work to ensure that free trade and free movement support sustainable growth, and we will aim for that growth to benefit individuals and communities across the country. And we will seek to make our economic policies serve the ends that Professor Galbraith outlined here in Sheffield more than 2 decades ago: personal well-being, cultural and educational advance, and enlarging life in general. Because I believe passionately that by doing so, we can help to create a wealthier, fairer, better, indeed happier society. And that's something that I have no doubt will bring major benefits to Scotland, but perhaps also major benefits to all of the nations of these islands. Thank you very much for having me here this evening. I now look forward to our discussions.
Thank you very much, First Minister, and wonderful to hear that echo of J.K. Galbraith, who spoke in this hall reconfigured rather differently. So he was stood about there talking to an audience, sat round there. I've no idea why.
Here?
In this very room, yeah, in 1994. We don't have the First Minister here for a huge amount of time tonight, but we do have some time for questions, and the First Minister is very keen to answer them, and there are some people ready to rove with microphones. I just have to be able to spot people that want to ask questions. So please now, hands up, questioners. I'd really like to start with a question from a woman first, but it's the men that have... is there somebody there? Excellent. Okay, thank you. The light is terrible up here, you know. There's a microphone coming to your right. We're going to take questions in groups of 3. So I'm looking out for 2 others. One there I've spotted, yeah. Go ahead, thanks.
Hello, hi. I was just wondering, during your discussion, you specified that concerns about immigration qualified as legitimate. How would you, as a First Minister of Scotland, define what actually is a legitimate concern? Thank you.
Gentleman just there with the pale blue shirt, yeah. And someone come along here, someone coming up behind you.
Welcome, First Minister. Can you envisage any situation where the SNP group in Westminster would vote to invoke Article 50?
Third person. There are other hands up.
Someone here?
Yeah, someone right at the front, just over here, well spotted. So microphone coming up behind you. Yeah. You're bound to get the Article 50 question.
Whether we remain in the single market or not, the EU product standards will have a huge impact on the UK society, and those standards are important for social protection, environmental protections, but the UK will not be participating in the discussion when they are actually set up. So how do you solve that democratic problem?
Okay, three very good questions. I'll try and answer them as briefly as I can. In relation to the first one about immigration, I really hope I didn't give you the wrong impression. I am unapologetically pro-immigration. I think people who want to come and live and study and work and contribute to our society do us an amazing honour, and I think we should welcome them and demonstrate that they are welcome here. Just as we have the freedom to go to other countries and live, work and study there. The point I was making was that there are, whether I agree with them or not, there are concerns about immigration that I don't think we can simply, if we want to develop and further this debate, that we can't simply dismiss. So whether some of those concerns come from perception rather than reality, others will come from the reality of finding it difficult to access public services. My view is that that's down to not investing enough in our public services, not down to immigration. So my point was not that I don't welcome immigration. I do, but there's always going to be a debate about that, and we need to try and understand and address the concerns that are being expressed about immigration. So that was the point I was seeking to make. Perhaps I didn't make it as well as I should have done. In terms of Article 50, no, I can't really foresee the circumstances where SNP MPs would vote to trigger Article 50. Not because, and don't misunderstand again here, not because I want to thwart the will of people in England and Wales, but because SNP MPs represent constituencies in Scotland, and every single constituency in Scotland voted to remain. The Remain vote in Scotland was by a much bigger margin than the Leave vote was in England and Wales. So every SNP MP that sits in the House of Commons is representing a constituency that voted to remain. So I think then for them to vote to trigger Article 50 that would take us out of the EU would be a difficult thing to justify. But as I said, I'm very keen that we play a part in trying to shape the position of the UK overall. I accept the result in England and Wales. I hope the result in Scotland is given equal respect. But perhaps there is some common ground that we can forge around the single market. I know, I don't know whether this would be the experience of people in this room, but I know from my own experience back home in Scotland, talking to some people who voted to leave, who didn't believe they were voting for the kind of hard Brexit that is now being put before them. So I think there is common ground to try to achieve there. Whether the UK government has the willingness to step onto it and to find it remains to be seen, if I can be as optimistic as that. And lastly, your point, the question was about staying in the single market, but perhaps not having the same, or not perhaps, definitely not having the same influence over the rules of the single market as we do as members of the European Union. That I absolutely accept is a downside of being in the single market but not being in the EU, which is why I described that in my remarks as not the best option, but the least worst option. So, I'm of the view, and I should say, I don't think the European Union is perfect. I could sit here and talk for the next 2 or 3 hours about the things I would like to change about the European Union, but I think we're better in it. I'm a Scottish nationalist. I believe Scotland should be independent, but I'm an internationalist. I believe in independent countries coming together to work for the common good on issues that no country can deal with on their own. So I think the best outcome is to be where we are just now in the EU. Being in the single market is not as good an outcome, and you've just identified one of the downsides of that. And if you talk to countries like, I was in Iceland 2 or 3 weeks ago, and that's certainly something that Iceland would recognise, that being in EFTA, in the EEA, but not in the EU, has a consequence in terms of accepting all the rules but not influencing them. So it's very much about me trying to find common ground that's about the least worst outcome, not the best one.
Thank you. Looking for 3 more questions. There's a person at front here, and I'm trying to look right at the back. Sorry, yes, there's someone right, hand up there, and I'll find a 3rd one in a moment when we've had this first question here.
Thank you, Nicola. Apart from wanting a selfie with you and Natalie Bennett before you leave, if that can be arranged. I'm a PhD student here at Sheffield, but I live in Leeds West, which is Rachel Reeves's constituency, which she called a tinderbox, and which had anti-Eastern European violence following the Brexit vote. And I was wondering what your response would be to the people there about resolving the tensions in a place like that, a white working class area of England.
Just there, yeah.
Hi there. You spoke about the social discourse internally, as Lady Durr just asked, and it's a real worry how Brexit and the sentiment in America for people who are working and are turning to extremes because of hopelessness. And I wonder, how do you tackle that externally? How do you tackle that internationally from your position as First Minister? And I just point out that actually you see the same sentiment from the 1930s after the great crash there, and what we see across Europe to the people fleeing to extremes and things like that.
Thank you. Third question, person right at the back by the blue curtain.
Thanks so much for a very interesting lecture. I think it's really heartening that, in 2016 we've got both yourself and Jeremy Corbyn, leaders of two major parties who are actively critical of austerity, trying to suggest alternatives. But with that in mind, Scottish councils this year and next year will carry out £1 billion worth of cuts to essential jobs and services, which will devastate working class communities. Is it time perhaps that the SNP move from criticising austerity to actively resisting these cutbacks, as councils in England, such as Liverpool, Lambeth and Clay Cross, have done in the past?
Thank you.
Okay. In terms of the question about social tension, and I'm going to, I don't know if that's wood, but I'm going to touch wood here when I say, because I'm not complacent about this and I don't take it for granted. But thankfully, we haven't seen any of that in Scotland, or not to any great extent since the referendum, and long may that continue. What do we do about that? I think there is such a leadership obligation on the part of all politicians. Why are we where we are on immigration? In my view, because too many mainstream politicians, almost all mainstream politicians, have given up or gave up on making the positive case for immigration. So instead, we got into a situation where the narrative that immigration was the problem and the reason for public service pressures, or unemployment or low wages in particular areas, was immigration. And I think there is now an obligation on all of us, and I would accept my own party from that, because we've at times when it's not always been easy or popular, taken a very different stance to that. But I think all politicians have to stand up and be very clear that somebody in Leeds who is in a low-wage job, or not in a job, or who's finding it difficult to get a hospital appointment, their enemy is not the immigrant living in the next street to them. The people that they need to be making their case to are the government at Westminster, who are implementing the cuts that are leading to many of those pressures. And we've got an opportunity now, I think, to do that, but it is going to take leadership on the part of politicians across the whole spectrum, which is why, I be pretty frank about it, I've never been a fan of the Conservative Party, but even taking that into account, I was utterly horrified to hear what came out of the Tory Party conference, which would suggest instead of seizing this moment to show some positive leadership, they're going in the opposite direction. Well, that just puts more of an obligation, in my view, on the rest of us. Which kind of takes me on to the second question: how do we play our part in trying to influence, the debates and some of the trends we're seeing across different parts of the world? And all I guess we can do fundamentally is try to lead by example, is to try to lead through our own policies and our own narratives and our own debate in the way we would want others to follow. And again, I don't want to sound here, so please don't hear it in this way as if I'm saying Scotland's got it all sus, because we don't. We have many challenges and many issues. I don't want to sound like some Scottish exceptionalist here going on about how great things are in Scotland all the time, but in some ways there is a living example there that politicians don't have to be divorced from public opinion. You know, I think possibly I'm the only leader across, in terms of government leader across the UK, who made a case in the EU referendum and actually saw a majority of the people I represent voting for that case. You know, I lead a party that, you know, sits at about 50% in the opinion polls, notwithstanding we're a party in government doing some really difficult things. So we don't get it right all the time. I'm not suggesting for a second that we do, but there's an example there that where you're prepared to show some leadership and take a stand on issues, you can take people with you. And I think fundamentally all we can do in terms of the global debate is lead by example and make sure we do what we can to put our own house in order and hope that we can influence the international debate in that way. And in terms of the question about austerity and the SNP and councils, and I'll say what we're doing in a second, but the way the Scottish Government is funded right now, like many councils, we're funded largely by block grant from Westminster, which has been cut substantially over the last few years, and if the UK Government doesn't change position, will be cut even more substantially in the years to come. We are now taking responsibility for more tax, principally income tax, which gives us obviously more financial flexibility. But we are, you know, last week in the Scottish Parliament we put through proposals that will raise council tax, particularly in the higher bands of housing, to try to ease the burden on local authorities. We have invested millions of pounds in Scotland over the last few years mitigating welfare cuts. So, you know, nobody in Scotland, even although it remains on the statute book at the moment, nobody in Scotland has to pay the bedroom tax, because we have invested money through local authorities to effectively subsidise the cost of the bedroom tax. So we are, you know, doing as much as we can within what has been a fixed budget to mitigate the impact of austerity. But, you know, my view is you can continue to mitigate austerity, and I think we've got an obligation to do that as far as we can, or you can stop austerity at source. And I think the time has come to stop austerity at source, which is why I hope we see some of that from the UK Government in the autumn budget statement, although I see that more in hope than expectation at the moment.
We're under very tight time constraints, but I can take just one more round of questions. There's a person just at the front here with a hand up, and then I'm going to go to the person right at the back with the blue. Yes, I've got sight of you, and then we'll find another one in a moment. As direct and crisp questions as you can manage, please.
Hi, Nicola. You've been talking recently about getting involved in the Supreme Court case, which obviously Gina Miller has just won in the High Court, and the government are now going to appeal that. I'm just wondering, you said you're actively considering it. Have you now decided to join that case? What's the latest on that? And also, just briefly, the SNP obviously has been talking about joining the European Union negotiations when Theresa May does invoke Article 50. If you don't get what you want, will you then call that second independence referendum?
You're not going to get an answer to that.
It's not a very controversial question.
Person at the back there. Thank you, yeah.
UKIP won nearly 4 million votes in the 2015 general election. A soft Brexit is undoubtedly a better option for the economy and for public sector spending, but isn't there a danger that a soft Brexit with preserved freedom of movement will be attacked by the right-wing media and lead to a huge swing towards UKIP by a significant proportion of those 17 million Leave voters in the next general election?
Listen to my watch. I think we'll just go with those.
Okay, in terms of the Supreme Court case, we are considering that just now and obviously taking advice of our legal advisors, and we haven't reached a final decision yet, but we will do that within the next couple of days. Obviously, there is a time pressure on that, but there are, you know, obviously big issues for Scotland. The case was principally about the use of the royal prerogative to trigger Article 50. There are, you know, issues around what's called the legislative consent process in the Scottish, Welsh and Northern Irish Parliament. So there are real issues at stake there, but we'll come to a final view on that over the next day or so. In terms of the second part of your question, yes, I mean, I can announce tonight that the date of the second Scottish independence referendum will be... yeah, look, I've been very, very clear. I mean, you know, I'm a lifelong advocate of Scottish independence, so I want Scotland to be independent. I think Scotland will become independent, and actually I think it will be one of the best things probably that happens to the relationship between Scotland and the rest of the UK. Scotland will cease to be what we sometimes can be, a bit gurning and moaning about, you know, the things that are done to us, and take responsibility, and I think that will actually have a positive benefit for the rest of the UK as well. The morning after the EU referendum, I could have quite easily said, that's it, we're going to have a second referendum, because our manifesto in May for the Scottish Parliament elections said that if this scenario happened, then the Scottish Parliament would have the right to have another referendum. I decided to take a different approach, to explore all options to protect our interests. But, you know, let me be plain about it. If we get into the situation where, notwithstanding all the warm words we heard 2 years ago about the UK being a partnership of equal nations, that actually Scotland's voice doesn't matter, our interests don't matter, and we've got a UK government that's just going to do whatever it likes, then yes, I do think in those circumstances we will be in a situation of having another independence referendum, because I think the people in Scotland will have the right to choose at that point. Do we want to go down that road, being dragged off the hard Brexit cliff by Theresa May and David Davis and Boris Johnson? God, what a prospect. Or do we want to choose the option of something better? So we're not at that stage yet, but if that's the situation we find ourselves in, then I hope people would understand the reasonableness of seeking to give ourselves that option again. And second question, I think, is a really important question, and I don't answer this lightly, because I think this is quite a defining moment. Certainly for Scotland, but I think for the UK as a whole. I said a moment ago that the reason I thought that I think we are where we are on Brexit and on immigration is because too many politicians have been scared to stand up and make the arguments for Europe and for immigration. You know, politicians, and again, you know, I will take some part of the responsibility here. Politicians for decades have blamed Europe for everything. So, you know, it can hardly be surprising that in a short campaign, when you start to say all the benefits of the European Union, people are not quite ready to believe that. Similarly with immigration, and I don't take responsibility for this, too few politicians have been prepared to make the arguments, the positive arguments for immigration, the benefits it brings to our society and our economy. So we are where we are, I think, because of an inability on the part of politicians to stand up and make tough arguments. So the defining moment now is, do we continue doing that? Do we continue trying to appease UKIP? And I'm not sure that the experience of the last couple of years tells us that that will end well. Or do we take this as the moment where we actually stand up and say, coming out of the single market will damage jobs, it will damage investment, it will damage the living standards of many of the very people who voted to leave because they were told it offered something better. So that's why I think now is the time for politicians to actually have the guts and the gumption to make the right arguments, even if they're difficult. Because if we continue to allow ourselves to be led by the nose by Nigel Farage, then I don't think it ends very well.
I know it'll disappoint everyone, but I've made a pact with the First Minister's office that she gets away the scheduled time.
I'm happy if you want to take a couple more questions.
Are you? That's what you could do if you're First Minister. You tell us when to stop then, Nicola.
A couple more. I better steady on. I've got to get back to Edinburgh tonight.
I can see the front better, so I'm trying to look at the back and be as fair as... Just here, okay, yeah. Please do. I think you might know this person.
It is Natalie.
Yeah.
I thought you said a Seth. I didn't actually know she was here.
Yeah.
Natalie and I usually do the group hug at the end of events like this, of course.
Well, we might be able to do that with the selfie as requested. I wanted to say welcome to Sheffield, and I wanted to say that I agree with a great deal of what you said, and I very much applaud the challenge you put out there to British politics, particularly to English politicians, to say, let's stand up to UKIP instead of pandering to them. I think that's hugely important. But I have got a question, don't worry. I welcome also the fact that you said that tackling climate change is a huge opportunity for our economy. We need to think of that rather than a cost. But I think we were talking about economic policy in the round, and perhaps what I feel was missing from the presentation was not just greening the economy, but transforming the economy so we live within the environmental limits of our one fragile planet. And that means more than just turning green, it means a transformation. So if you could comment on that.
I should say that question was posed by Natalie Bennett, former leader of the Green Party, who's come to live in Sheffield. Last question then, unless Nicola overrules me again, which I'm happy to be overruled. Person at the back with yes, that's it. You've got my eye.
Obviously, you ran a very successful stay campaign in terms of the Scottish outcome, but it wasn't enough overall. So if you could go back before Brexit and rerun your campaign, can you think of anything in particular you'd do differently?
Okay. Well, firstly, nice to see you, Natalie. I absolutely take the point of your question there, but apologies if this didn't come through strongly enough, I don't actually think we can do what we require to do around climate change without the kind of transformation that you're talking about. Now, I'm quite proud of the progress we've made in Scotland. We set targets on carbon emission reductions that were way beyond what other countries did at the time. We've met them, but we've now got to go much further, and not that it's been easy getting to where we've got to just now, but it's going to be much, much more difficult to get to where we now need to go. So, what that's going to demand of us is transformational, and it will be transformational in many respects in a quite challenging and difficult sense, because it will challenge things that all of us take for granted right now in how we live our lives, and it will span transport, agriculture, hugely important in Scotland. It will, touch on, how people insulate their homes, and in a whole range of different ways that are very, very directly impacting on everyday lives. And I think by necessity, even if we weren't setting out to do that, we're not going to succeed unless we are transformational in our thinking. So, we'll set out over the early part of next year a new climate change plan, new energy strategy that will encapsulate a lot of this, and I think you will see the transformational impact of that, because we'll fail if we don't do that. I think we've probably got as far as we will get on climate change by doing I hesitate to say easy things because they're not easy, but by doing the relatively easy things. The road ahead is much tougher, and for governments that is quite challenging, but the consequences of failing are also horrendously challenging. So hopefully we'll, and we have a good Green group in the Scottish Parliament that keeps the pressure on us to do all of these things, so you don't have to worry too much about us on that front, I hope. In terms of the second question, Scotland voted by more than 60% to remain. I would have loved to have seen that higher. But if I was to answer, well, I am going to answer that question honestly. I think in order to fundamentally change the outcome of the referendum, we possibly would need to go back a lot longer than just, the few short weeks of the campaign itself. I think there are some things that David Cameron at the time could have done differently. I tried to persuade him to do certain things differently. I tried to persuade him to give the vote to 16 and 17-year-olds, for example, which I'm pretty sure he regrets not doing now. So I think there are things that I think a campaign that had been longer, although that would have had downsides, might have enabled some of these debates to have been engaged in more meaningfully. But I think if we're talking about turning the clock back, then it's about turning the clock back long enough to do what I was talking about earlier on, to take on some of the arguments around the benefits of Europe and the benefits of immigration in order to counter the downsides of both of those things. Because trying to do that I know how hard it was. For example, we tried to make a key plank of the campaign about social protection, about employment and social protections. And if it was hard to do that even in Scotland that was tending towards Remain, then I can't imagine how much harder that must have been in England, because trying to make those arguments, talking about the benefits in a few short weeks, when for decades before all people had heard were the downsides and the negatives, and nobody, I mean, who in UK politics had ever before given the European Union credit for maternity and paternity rights or holiday pay? Nobody had. So as we tried to do it in a 3-week period, we were fighting a losing battle. So I think turning the clock back significantly is what we would have required to do to fundamentally change the dynamic of those arguments, to change the final outcome.
I think we probably are stopping there, because the First Minister's now got a 4.5, 5-hour drive back to Edinburgh, and I gather a cabinet meeting to chair tomorrow morning, so it's not easy. Before we stop there are just some thanks that I have to express to a range of people very briefly. First is to the various members of the First Minister's office with whom I corresponded at length in order to bring this evening's event about, and they were unfailingly helpful and courteous. I want to thank as well Polly and the events team at the university, who I think do these evenings brilliantly. I want to thank Laura and my colleagues in SPERI, who've worked so professionally in so many ways also to bring tonight about. I want to thank the ESRC Festival for the Social Sciences for meeting some of tonight's costs. Hugely and sincerely, I want to thank everybody here for coming in such numbers, and thanks to those of you unseen and watching wherever you are this evening via live streaming, including, I believe, my 2 sons. But thanks above all, First Minister, to you for delivering such a provocative and strong talk, and for answering questions with such obvious passion and commitment to your views. It's been an honour to have you here, an honour for SPERI, for the university, and I think also for the city and people of Sheffield. So thank you very much indeed.